Hello, everyone. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the conversation. Happy Wednesday to all of you that are tuning in, whether you are joining us live from the Facebook page or whether you are joining us live from the YouTube channel. Thank you for taking some time out of your evening. This is a very, very special episode of the conversation. Of course, I say that about all the episodes, but this one is particularly important because some of the issues that we are going to talk about with our guests tonight are, of course, very important as we take this deeper dive into the criminal justice system. But more importantly, we're going to talk about her personal journey. And she is someone that I have greatly admired for a long time. So it is such a pleasure for me to have her on the show. So if you are just joining us, one thing that I do want you to know is that one of the big things that's been super important to us here at the conversation is that we are making sure that we're getting information out on whatever our topic area is in a major way. So as far as this series goes with the indictment series that began really at the beginning of the Ahmaud Arbery case, what we decided to do was to take a deep dive in the criminal justice system in a way that would allow us to really be able to put ourselves in a situation where we are really talking about the criminal justice in a meaningful way, and that we are actually taking a deep dive into the criminal justice system. And so what we started with this series literally started off as four very simple parts, or at least that was the theory. And what I found through the discussions with our various shows and with our various guests is that it was important for us to take on this deeper look at the criminal justice system, but also from multiple perspectives. That being said, what we where we started was specifically with our first show, which was an overview, if you will, of the criminal justice system, and our guests were Renee Little, attorney Renee Little, and of course attorney Rob Corbett. And what we did is that we talked about a number of the cases that have obviously been dominating the news as far as police brutality and things of that nature. But we also talked about what we thought was even more important, which was implicit bias and how that impacts the justice system. That was our first segment. Our second segment was taking a deeper dive and looking at the criminal justice system from the perspective of police reform. And our guests were Vicki Foster, a retired assistant chief Vicki Foster of the Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department, and Keith Way, retired detective of Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department. And we were able to really talk about the criminal justice system from the perspective of a police officer, talking about the thin blue line, talking about real and tangible reforms. And they both have amazing ideas. And we're going to further that discussion as we get closer to the end of this series. And then our next guest was Mecklenburg County Sheriff Gary McFadden. Called that episode Sugar Free Talk, an ode, if you will, to his Instagram name, but also because of how he is and who he is as a person. And we had a one-on-one conversation talking about his history from him, from his beginnings in South Carolina to coming to Charlotte, to becoming a police officer, a police detective, a reality star through I Am Homicide, and eventually becoming elected as our sheriff here in Mecklenburg County. Last week's episode was particularly powerful, I think, from the perspective of it being more an emotional and a more personal dive into the criminal justice system, because we talked to two people, Anna Lee Harden and Arkevius Armstrong, and we talked about their perspective having been in the system, whether it had been locally in a detention center, whether it had been in a state prison or even in a federal prison. And what we talked about specifically were reforms that needed to happen, their own personal experiences having been incarcerated, the reasons why they ended up incarcerated, but more importantly, their story of redemption. Because we didn't want to just talk about what was happening as far as their experiences being behind bars, but more importantly, we wanted to talk about their stories of redemption, and it was completely powerful. We are going to follow up with that show because it gave me the idea of one of the last questions we asked was, what do we do, or how do we as a community help people who are re-entering society? Because oftentimes there's no safety net. There's not a lot of options out there to keep a person from going back into the system. And we have to do a better job, of course, of addressing the recidivism rate that we're dealing with on a regular basis. So for those of you who are joining us, whether it is through the watch party or whether it is through directly through either the YouTube channel or the Facebook page, make sure you drop a wave, drop a hello. If you have questions or comments, you can drop those in the comments because we will be able to see them. And of course, if you have any questions, make sure that you drop them there so that we can answer some of your questions. If you're watching us through the watch party, I can see your questions and your comments. Send us a wave, let us know that you're here. And of course, as always, if you have not already done so, I need you to like the Instagram page, follow the Facebook page, and subscribe to the YouTube channel at All Things Social Media at the Convo Pod Show. So our guest tonight, as I indicated, is someone that I personally have admired and respected for a long period of time, and she recently has made history. I'm not going to go into a lot of details into her background because I think it's important for us to have that free-flowing conversation. But what we are going to talk about tonight specifically is the color of justice, what the justice system looks like from the perspective of the judiciary specifically, some of the reforms that she is looking at and taking a closer look at, and I think, frankly, a very courageous way. And we're going to talk about how race impacts the courts from a judicial perspective. Having been on the bench myself, I definitely do and feel and understand some of the issues that judges face as far as being on the bench, but she has a very unique perspective in her own journey. So welcome to the show, everyone. I give you North Carolina Supreme Court Chief Justice, yes ma'am, yes sir, you heard it, Chief Justice Sherry Beasley. Welcome to the show. It is such an honor to have you.
Thank you so much for having me, Yolanda.
So we've got a lot of ground to cover, and I'm sure a lot of people want to say hello and to ask questions. Earl, I see you, Annetta, Kim, Darren, thank you all for joining us. But I want to really talk about you for the first part of this, who you are, what your background is, and what your story is, because people see the title, but they don't have an opportunity to really get to know the person. So first and foremost, where are you from? And what were you like as a kid growing up?
Well, I'm actually originally from Nashville, Tennessee, and then what was I like as a kid growing up? I always really enjoyed school, and loved to play. There was a time when kids were outside and made mud pies, and I loved making mud.
Did you play restaurant? Because I know some of us, I know I played restaurant. Did you play restaurant with your mud pies?
I played restaurant with my mud pies.
I love it.
But I was a normal kid. I was, and, was active in high school and student government and debate team and those kinds of things. Went to college at Rutgers University in New Jersey. Douglas College was the largest women's college in the nation, and then went to law school at the University of Tennessee, and then actually just 2 years ago received my LLM from Duke University in Judicial Studies.
Outstanding. So we got to go back for a second because I too was a debater. What was your event?
Oh gosh, I did it all really. I just loved it, and I certainly love the writing piece, and I love all the oratorical pieces of it.
Did you did you ever do Lincoln Douglas and policy, or did you prefer the Lincoln Douglas style over the speed of policy debate?
I did both, and I would say I preferred Lincoln Douglas.
I was the total opposite. I love that speed. That's probably why I get yelled at now for talking too fast, but there we go. And so in high school, you described yourself as being involved in student government debate and things of that nature. Did you know at that time that you wanted to go to law school?
I really didn't. I did know that I would get a graduate degree. I didn't really know in what. And after college, I even applied to many kinds of graduate programs, MBA, MPH, NPA, social work, and thought about a lot of different professions. But the thing that I was confident of is that I could easily see myself as an advocate, regardless of which one of those professions I chose.
Do you think that was more related to your upbringing or your experiences as you were going through high school and through college?
A combination of both. I grew up in a family of very strong women,
Hmm.
all of whom were advocates, mostly for children. And so I could easily see that as my role is an extension of that to some extent. I do think that after law school, I worked as a server at O'Charlie's, and I also worked at the Tennessee Human Relations Commission. And it was there that I worked with lawyers who were working on claims of discrimination based on race and gender and handicapability in places of public accommodation, employment, and housing. And I think
Mm.
it was there that really sort of solidified for me that law school was the place for me.
I have to step back for a second because you mentioned that your family, you come from a family of advocates. How many siblings do you have?
I have no siblings.
So it's just you.
That's me.
So you're the family of advocates. Tell us about that.
Well, my mom, even though she was a graduate school educator, was an advocate. I mean, her undergraduate work was in social work, and she had an MSW and a DSW, and so she was an advocate for children. She often spoke at congressional hearings and for the White House, but really had a very grassroots grasp on
Mhm.
children, and much of her focus was on adoptions. So,
Mm.
but there were lots of people in my family who had those kinds of experiences, educators and other folks, and that had a real bearing on my life.
Mm. I see a lot of people waving at you. So let me give a few shout outs. So I see you, Sean, Shamira, Romeo, Yolanda, Miss Barbara, Renee, Aaron, Mr. Lavity. I see you. If you guys have questions, especially if you're joining us on the watch party, make sure that you drop your questions in the comments. If you're joining us from YouTube or if you're joining us from the conversation page, then you can drop your questions in the comments and I can see them there and we can answer as many as we can get to. So fast forward, you said that your experience that made you decide that you wanted to go to law school. Did you go straight from undergrad or did you do some other things before you decided to go to law school?
I took the 1 year and worked at the Tennessee Human Relations Commission and as
Okay.
a server at O'Charlie's. I took
Okay.
1 year. I did both of those things during that 1 year, and then I went to law school.
Okay. And where did you go to law school?
University of Tennessee.
Okay. And so when you went to law school, what were your aspirations at that point? Was it to be more of a litigator? Were you interested in doing more public service work? Or did that kind of evolve through your law school process?
I'm not sure that I had that kind of direction in law school. I didn't know a lot of lawyers growing up.
Hmm.
And there were certainly no lawyers in my family since that time. There's some folks who are older than me who went to law school, but there were no lawyers in my family. So I didn't have that model. Back in the day, like a lot of African Americans, we all said we wanted to go into corporate law. We
Hmm.
really didn't have a sense of what that meant in a lot of ways.
Right.
So I can't really tell you that when I went to law school that I really had a sense of direction about how I would put my advocacy desires to use.
And so when did that change? When did you know that that's the direction that you wanted to go?
It was really probably after law school. I started out at the district attorney's office in Wake County for a bit of time, and then I ended up at the public defender's office in Cumberland County,
Hmm.
which was especially a really valuable experience to be with people who were charged with from the least serious to the most serious offenses, to really appreciate their humanity in this, and
Hmm.
their families, and to really understand the road they travel to get to be my client was hugely important. And I think that experience helped me not just as a lawyer, but really as a person. I think it shaped the kind of judge I became, the kind of wife, the kind of mother I am, um, because so many of them were brilliant,
Hmm.
and really good people at heart, but just for a whole host of circumstances that I don't think we can discount, found themselves in situations that they never would have wanted for themselves or for their families. Just like you and me, they had the same hopes and dreams for their families, and really wanted to do good. I mean, they really had, they wanted for their children what we want for our children.
Right.
At that level of humanity, I think it's important to be able to connect with people.
So how many years were you at the district attorney's office before you went to the public defender's office?
Just a few months. I spent most of my time, I was at the public defender's office in Fayetteville for about 5 years.
And did you find that you felt like you were drawn more so to the defense side at that time, or do you think it was just the nature of what the office was, at least on the district attorney side at that time?
I had an appreciation for both sides, and I know most people tend to have a preference, but I really did and still have an appreciation for both sides. I think lawyers, prosecutors, and defense attorneys can do good things for folks. And I think it also takes a strong hand and a strong will for both kinds of attorneys, depending on their respective roles in those cases. And so I can't tell you that I necessarily had a preference, but spending more time in the public defender's office was a very meaningful experience to me, and it shaped who I am.
And so were you doing everything from misdemeanors to serious felonies during the time that you were there?
I was.
And during that time, because you talk very authentically in terms of, what you were seeing as far as your representation of people, did you find that, particularly being in Cumberland County, because you talk about military and all of that as well, did you find that it was more of the issues that you saw that people were facing were more economic issues, or were there more social issues that were leading to, the problems that ended up them having a situation where they were dealing with a criminal charge?
Often there was a combination of both, and so much of their actions and so much of their being really was rooted in pain.
Mm-hmm.
And so there certainly is, and Cumberland County is a low wealth county, and certainly there is a level of poverty there that is real.
Mm-hmm.
So there was certainly that, but so much, and not just Cumberland County, but we know, and we know how we have the data to support that so much of the way people manifest their pain is through their actions.
Now that's very powerful, the way that people manifest their pain. And I think understanding that from the judicial perspective is particularly important, because you don't want to see people as a record. You don't want to see them as what they are on paper and not having the opportunity to really get to know them. So I want to just take a different turn for a second. So once you left the public defender's office, did you go into private practice? What was your journey after you decided to leave the public defender's office?
I did not. I went straight to the bench. So
Okay.
I was appointed as a district court judge in Cumberland County in 1999.
Okay. And when you were appointed, did you handle all aspects of, was it district or superior?
District.
Okay. So when you came in district, did you handle from juvenile on, or did you have a particular niche when you were doing district court work?
I presided in all the courts. I was a family court judge and a certified juvenile court, but I certainly presided in criminal and civil and traffic.
And so when did you know? When did you know that you wanted to become a judge? Was there a particular moment that stuck out when you decided that you wanted to take that next step? What was it that made you decide you wanted to do that?
I can't tell you that it was something that I necessarily initially saw for myself in that way. There were a lot of people who were encouraging me once we had some vacancies in Fayetteville. And having colleagues encourage me to see that this was something that I really could do. It was a way I could offer myself for service, was certainly very helpful. The reality is I was a lawyer by the time I saw an African-American woman serving as a judge. And I think often it's easier to see yourself in those kinds of leadership roles when you know and have seen other people like you who are doing the same thing.
And do you think, so when you decided and you took that first day before you first entered the courtroom for the first time, because I kind of remember how scared I was before I entered the door, was the well, before I asked that question, was so the bench at that time wasn't diverse. Is it fair to say before when you were were appointed to the bench?
Out of 11 judges, there was one African American man in service.
Okay. And did you feel a certain amount of pressure, given the fact that you were a young judge coming onto the bench in an environment that wasn't particularly diverse?
I was young, and so there is always that pressure. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not sure I necessarily felt the pressure from the stance of being not terribly diverse.
Mm-hmm.
But I was aware that
Mm-hmm.
my service made a difference. And I was aware that it made a difference, and it made a huge difference, and really created a sense of pride in the community that I had been appointed. It mattered
Mm-hmm.
to not just the people in the courthouse, but it mattered to the people in the community that there was a young African American woman in service.
And so day one, you open the door, bailiff says, "All rise." What are you feeling? What's going on in your mind at that point?
Well, I felt and continue to feel an awesome responsibility. When we go to court, we are making decisions about people's everyday lives. And sometimes I think some of the work becomes routine, if you will. But the reality is, if somebody steps into the courtroom and they don't have a driver's license, I mean, you and I take for granted what having a driver's license is. We don't really think twice about it. But
Right.
not having a driver's license can uh, be a world of difference about how people are able to navigate their lives. And so I've always felt that sense of the gravity of the position, and to really appreciate often that knowing the backstory,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's a speeding ticket or whether it is something more serious. It's just important to know about people's journey, and to understand them, to have a better sense of who they are, how they come before the court, because I think it also helps to shape judgments.
And so at that point, when you, let's say within your first year or two of being on the bench, what was the thing that you think most surprised you about your service?
Uh,
Personal or professional, because that could go both ways, because professionally it's a different world. And being prepared for being under a microscope in a different way is can be a bit of a challenge. So that can be either from a personal perspective or a professional perspective in terms of, what surprised you when you first became a member of the bench.
well, I'll tell you what I absolutely did not expect was that my friends would start calling me Judge Beasley. I just did not. I mean, I knew that the lawyers with whom I was close and had personal relationships, I knew that they would respect my role and my title, and I knew that
Mm-hmm.
they would refer to me as Judge Beasley in the courtroom. But I thought once I was off the bench, they would just call me Sherry, and it just didn't happen that way. And it's more than it just didn't happen that way. It was really symbolic of the fact that there had to be this really a division in our relationship, that our relationships necessarily had to change. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not sure that I was necessarily prepared for that.
So I see a couple of questions. One of the questions, which is an interesting one, Benita wants to know when is it too old to pursue a law career? Is there such a thing as being too old?
I'm certainly not one to say that it's too old to. I mean, I just told you that I received my master's of laws degree 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not too old. Nobody's ever too old to learn more, to make efforts to contribute to the betterment of who we are, and to. So I know, and so if that's something that anybody's interested in, I think that's a wonderful thing to pursue. And the one thing about a law degree is that it's so versatile. You can do so much with it, and
Mm-hmm.
it's a wonderful background and foundation for a lot of things.
Excellent. And so for those of you who are just joining us, because I see some questions that are popping up on the watch party, and I see some questions in the comments. I'll get to as many of them as I can. Some of them we definitely are going to talk about. But if you're just joining us, or if you're joining us for the replay, if you do have questions, make sure that you drop them in the comments. Obviously, here with North Carolina Supreme Court Chief Justice Sherry Beasley, she made history becoming the first African-American female Chief Justice here in the state of North Carolina, appointed by Governor Roy Cooper. And we're going to talk in a little bit about some of the, I would say, innovative and almost courageous, no, I would say courageous changes, and really taking a closer look at the intersection between race and the courts and what that means as far as the judicial system. So now let's have a real talk moment. So you're on the bench, district court. Do you go directly to Superior Court, or do you decide to run for statewide office at that point?
I served for 10 years on the district court, and then I ran for the Court of Appeals and thankfully was successful.
Okay. So I want to stay for a second with district court, because one of the things that's very interesting, particularly I think as a female judge, is how did you handle the microaggressions that you may have seen from some of your male colleagues? Because it happens. But how did you handle those? How did you navigate those and still be able to administer justice without having to address those in a way that's not positive, if you know what I mean?
I do know what you mean. And, I don't know that I'm always conscious of it. Not that it's not happening, but conscious of how I'm addressing it. The one thing that I learned early on, however, is that we can carry our feelings around about that and do nothing about it and feel horribly. Or we can say something and even be quaking in our boots. But the saying something and saying the right thing is so important. And in my mind, it's less important because it's a teachable moment. It's more important about how I feel when I walk away.
Right.
That people understand that whatever their issues are about me are theirs. They're not mine. And that they don't have the right to attempt to diminish who I am.
Yolanda asked, she said that she heard that you indicated that you were from Tennessee. What was your attraction to serving the bench? And I presume she means as an attorney here in North Carolina.
Well, I got married. I like this guy a whole lot. And he had roots and still does in North Carolina. And we have now been married for 27 years. So that's how I got to North Carolina.
Outstanding. And so you decided to run for the Court of Appeals. What year was that?
2000. I was successful in 2008, and I decided to run in 2007, I believe.
So what's it like running for statewide office? Because most people, it's hard enough doing a local race, but imagine you have to cover an entire state. Do you start a year and a half out? Give us an idea of, at least for what your plan was the first time you ran. And then what's that really like as far as trying to do that and still be a full-time judge? Because it's not like you can't stop the work that you're doing on the bench in district court, but you're also obviously running for statewide office. What's that like?
It takes about 19 months, and it is a lot. I never missed a day of court. And so it did mean a lot of travel. Mecklenburg County became my second home, as it does every one of my election years. 2008 was an incredible time to be running. It was a historic election. There was so much excitement. And it was a wonderful time. It is a grueling schedule to be in Asheville 1 minute and then back in court the next day. So I very rarely spent the night away from home, but I also very rarely spent the night away from home because our sons, I have twin sons who are now 19, but at the time they would have been 7. And so it was important to me to make sure that we started the day together. And so I always, regardless of wherever I was that night, I was going to be home in the morning, and we were going to spend our mornings together. And so it's tough. I'm thankful that my mom came to live with us during that period of time. We needed that support system. And frankly, I would not have run. I mean, I was happy as a district court judge, and I would not have run if I didn't, there was no duress. I mean, she could have easily have said no, and we would have just changed the plan. But I would not have run if she had not been able to be with our family.
And so during that process of running, you didn't miss a day in court. How did you manage when it did become heavy and when it did become stressful and tiring? Like, what was it that you had to do to keep yourself uplifted during that time?
A whole lot of prayer, which is the same thing that gets me through now, and the balance of family. I mean, family just offers your life a very different perspective. And two little boys running around being just as wonderful as they could be. Um,
Mhm.
it always helps me. They're big boys now, but it
Mhm.
always helps me stay grounded and focused on what I'm doing. But it's stressful. I mean, working on family court orders is stressful because
Mhm.
when families are in trouble, and they're coming to court for a just solution to their problems, it's stressful to think about how best to do that, and balancing all of that with travel, campaigning, um,
Mhm.
and family, which of course is also very important.
Do you think the fact that you were a public defender, obviously a district court judge, do you think that gave you an edge in terms of adjusting to being on the Court of Appeals because you had so much experience in trying cases? Or do you think that learning curve really, it just depends on the person once they make it to the appellate level?
I certainly think that being a public defender and being a district court judge have shaped who I am as a judge, as a mom, as a chief justice, and I do think that it helped with the learning curve. But I'll say this. It's just different being at the Court of Appeals. It's a court of record.
Mhm.
It's not a court where you see witnesses and parties. I mean, the cases about which the appellate courts make decisions. Those courts rarely see the parties about whom they're making the decisions. And so I think being in a trial court judge certainly helped that, but it's also quite a transition
Mhm.
to go from being the trier of fact in the district court to being serving on a panel of three at the
Mhm.
Court of Appeals. And so it was indeed a transition in so many ways.
And for those of you watching, I think that's very important, especially understanding one, that our judges are elected and only appointed in certain circumstances, but two, just the general nature of the appellate process, because we have the Court of Appeals, and then there's only certain ways that a case can actually get to the Supreme Court, which is where you are now. So how long? So you were on the Court of Appeals for 2 terms, is that correct?
I was there for 4 years, so
Okay.
half a term.
Half a term, my mistake, because you are so awesome. Okay, let's get to that. All right. So you and I met when I was campaigning in 2014 to become a district court judge, and you were campaigning for Supreme Court at that point. And what I really thought was so interesting just at that time, because we were in a midterm, if you will, election cycle, but there was still so much energy around that particular election. And I remember, um, at that point, at least in Mecklenburg County, there were 3 African American women that were running against 3 white male incumbents. And I remember the day that the 3 of us won, that was the headline. It wasn't, so and so defeat so and so. It was 3 African American women defeat 3 white male incumbent judges. And that, when I saw that headline, it was like, okay, from a political standpoint, I felt like, okay, things are going to change because people aren't seeing us winning on our own merits of getting out there and campaigning. But it was the race issue. In your election, it was not quite that issue, but there was a challenge to the results of your election. And that was the first time, and correct me if I'm wrong, was that the first time that they had the R and the D designation at that point? I can't remember if or had it been already up there already.
No, we 2016, so that was actually after my election.
Okay. And so while you're waiting for your results to be certified, did you have any concerns or, to put it differently, were you confident that the results were going to be certified in your favor?
So election night of November 2014, I was leading my opponent by 3,000 votes. And there were nearly 2.5 million votes cast in
Mm.
the election. And 26 days later, after I had to hire lawyers and
Wow.
auditors in every single county in the state, um, I won by 5,410 votes. So if people want to know if every vote counts, I assure you that every vote counts. Was I worried? Um, I had real peace, frankly. I certainly hoped to win. I worked really, really hard in that election. But I had peace for another reason, really. The Supreme Court elections are so much more different than other judicial elections. And
Mhm.
there's a lot of outside money from outside of North Carolina spent in those races.
Mhm.
It tends to be spent around the nation, and I can tell you the results of every single Supreme Court election since 1985 in every single state.
Wow.
Um, that money tends to be spent by against women and African Americans, and that's what happened in 2014.
Mhm.
My opponent and I had raised about the same amount of money, and then like 3 weeks before the election, it's public information how the money is spent and where it's spent. So
Mhm.
these outside groups were able to determine where I didn't spend. I certainly didn't have any more money at that point, and so they were able to spend in those areas. That'll
Mhm.
happen to me again this year. It will happen that my race has already been targeted. I already know that I will have to raise at least $3 million, but this is what happens across the nation.
Mhm. And I think now, fast forward when you were appointed to become Chief Justice, where were you? Was it a phone call? Was it in person? How did you find out? And what did that feel like?
No, the governor called me to the executive mansion and told me.
Mhm.
And actually, um, when he told me, I really thought I was there to make the case for why I should be the next chief. I didn't know that I was there for him to actually appoint me.
Wow. Uh-huh.
Um, and it was obviously a beautiful moment. I was, of course, thrilled. Um, and then he would make the public announcement through a press conference the next day.
Mm. So no jumping up and down. You didn't take your heels off. We won't tell anybody. It was definitely a moment for sure. I can imagine.
It was quite a moment, but no, I did not jump up and down in the executive mansion, the governor's mansion. I did not do that.
Oh,
I waited until I left before I did that.
I love it. So once you are appointed, very shortly thereafter, here comes COVID. And we are navigating a very different space. But before, COVID happens and we're dealing with what we've dealt with in the last few months, what was the biggest challenge that you felt like you faced initially becoming the Chief Justice? And um, were you prepared for that?
Wow, there were lots of challenges. I mean, just making the transition from associate justice to chief justice is a huge transition.
Mhm.
Uh, Making the transition from one chief justice to the next chief justice is a huge transition. It was frankly right before hurricane season, also.
Mm.
So often, I think when we are further east and west, we don't think about the fact that the people on the coast are having a really difficult time, and so the same kinds of emergency directives that I'm entering now. I was having to do that in those areas where courthouses were closed and families were displaced. And I mean, it was really a very difficult time for those courthouses and court officials and court staff and those communities. Um, of course, as the Chief Justice, I lead the Supreme Court. There are seven of us. I'm proud to tell you we have the most diverse Supreme Court in the nation. There are three African American justices. There are three women, and the court is 200 years old. And so we have the first Jewish member of the court. And as Chief Justice, I also lead the entire judicial branch of government. And so there are courts all across this state that I lead, more than 300 court facilities across the state, oversee a budget of more than $500 million. And so it's a lot of responsibility. So there were a lot of big transitions, and things were happening very fast.
And so when you first assumed the position and the role, did you find that the administrative part of it was, I don't want to say daunting, that's not the word I'm looking for, but did you find it a challenge from this perspective? Because people do things in different counties and different parts of the state, and you have to make decisions that, you know, affect that county, or it could affect the state. So how is there a particular way that you go about when you're making those major decisions? Is it just more quiet meditation, thinking it through, or do you have more of a pragmatic process when you're making those bigger decisions that affect the statewide?
Well, it just depends. I'm thankful I've got a wonderful director at the Administrative Office of the Courts,
Mm-hmm.
McKenna Newton, who is also the first African American to serve as director of AOC. And so I often lean on him, and we're often in discussions about what needs to happen. And there are a host of other stakeholders, just depending on what the issue is that I'm often consulting with.
And can you just explain briefly to those people who are watching, because they may not know what the role of the administrative office of the courts is versus your role, and how do they work together?
Well, the Administrative Office of the Courts is the administrative arm. It handles all of the funds for the judicial branch, and for all of the state funding for courts goes through AOC. Um, uh, uh, Almost every single resource that can be provided by the state to courts goes through the Administrative Office of the court of the courts. And so, in my mind, it is the role of the Administrative Office of the courts to be of assistance and to support local courts across the state.
And so do individual courts get a particular budget, or if they need other things or other resources, they go through the AOC or administrative office of the courts in order to get those items or things that they need? Is that right?
Generally speaking, there are some exceptions. But for instance, right now we're in the middle of a pandemic, and we're working really hard to get PPE through the Administrative Office of the Courts to courts around the state.
Okay. And so now here comes the coronavirus. You find yourself having to make an announcement that courts are going to be closed, I think initially for 30 days. What do you think the biggest weaknesses biggest weaknesses that have been exposed as a result of coronavirus and having to shut the court down, at least initially for that first 30 days?
Well, and remember, the courts remained open.
Well, let me be clear. My
we
apologies.
we
The,
greatly reduced
some things were closed. We greatly reduced activity, but it did expose some weaknesses as far as the system in general, in terms of access and trying to navigate, particularly in the larger counties, with things that have to happen by statute, for example. So, yes, ma'am.
Well, and really everywhere, because I mean, it just no. I mean, the statute is the statute, regardless of where you live. And I think one of the greatest weaknesses is the lack of sound technology has been blatant. And we knew that's where we were. We are in 2020. I'm embarrassed to tell your audience, we're still using MS-DOS systems in 2020. And so in our courts, all of them. And so we just really ought to be somewhere else. If we had had e-courts or the integrated case management system, which is coming up and running and funded by the legislature, we would be in a very different place. We should be at a place where we are electronic filing. We should be at a place where we are allowing service by email, and those things are happening. We should be in a place where if you, Attorney Trotman, have a trial in New Hanover County, but the files are in Mecklenburg, you shouldn't have to be thinking about how to tote court files from one county to the next. I mean, we should be at a place, and we will be at a place where you should be anywhere in the world on your own personal device, able to access those files. And so that's where we're headed. The first counties where we will implement e-courts are Wake, Harnett, Johnston, and Lee. And then the next phase will be Mecklenburg. So I am super excited about that. It will completely change the way you practice law. But the other great thing about it is, in a lot of the urban areas, we take for granted that the courthouse tends to be fairly accessible to a lot of people. But in a lot
Mhm.
of the rural areas, it's not uncommon for the courthouse to be 20 miles or more away. And so,
Mhm.
if you can go to your own personal device and do a lot of that business online, that will be life changing for a lot of communities.
Absolutely, absolutely. And for those of you who are just joining, I see several people waving. We see you. But if you have questions, make sure that you drop them in the comments, because I want to shift gears, because one of the big things that I think that um, you have taken very seriously, and it is so admirable, is that you're not afraid to talk about race. You're not afraid to have real conversations about race and how it impacts the administration of justice. Tell us a little bit about some of the initiatives that you have started the process of really taking a closer look at that people may not know about.
Well, I know the world was jolted into a different reality when George Floyd was killed, and so there was a whole outcry by people all over North Carolina and across the nation around racial disparities in institutions, to include courts. But long before George Floyd died, I had already begun working on a lot of these matters. What I did not know was when he died, I made a public statement
Mhm.
about racial disparities in our courts. But I did not know at the time that I was the first Chief Justice in the nation to do so.
You
Um,
were.
Featured in the Wall Street Journal and in the New York Times. And since that time, other chiefs have come forward, as well as other courts. And many of them have been in touch with me about how we can do some national efforts. But the other piece of that is, I think it's really important that the Chief Justice be willing to acknowledge that there are racial disparities, that when people come to our courts and believe that there are two kinds of justice systems, it's not just their belief. We actually have the data to support uh, those beliefs. And so we got to more than just acknowledge it. It's important for us to be proactive about how we not just have constructive conversations about how we can change, but be motivated by this reality and really make some earnest changes in our courts.
And you did a state of the courts address recently. And what most people, I mean, we're only 200 years old. It's not that we're not that old in terms of a system. And your appointment, obviously, to the Supreme Court was historic. Now, taking the robe off and thinking in terms of just being an African American woman in this role, do you what do you believe is probably most important now, having had the courage to make the statement that you made, to really have a real conversation about the racial disparities, and how do we begin to address it, at least from a judicial perspective?
Well, we are. We're not just. I'm not just out here making statements about it. I mean, we're really going to make some real efforts, and I will have a commission, and you all will certainly be hearing more about that. And the commission will not be designed to study the issue. We don't need to study the issue. The prior Chief Justice commissioned a study, and we know that more than half of North Carolinians have no trust and confidence in the courts. And so we have that information. We don't need to study it anymore. We need to be about making some real changes, and that's what we'll be doing. Um, and I mean, that's, it's hard for me, frankly, to separate my role as Chief Justice and as an African American woman, because I've only ever been an African American woman.
Mm-hmm.
So, we know, and I knew, when I was appointed, that I'm appointed for a reason. I'm in service at this time for a reason, and it is to make some changes, and it is to help us to really think deeply about some realities. And it's also a time for us to really think differently about training and about biases and about racism.
And what ideas do you have to address the training issues specifically? I know there's obviously implicit bias training and things of that nature, but the training issues I think is particularly interesting when it relates to the support staff and all of that within the courts themselves.
And I think it does have to be holistic. I don't think it's just judges, although I think as leaders of the court system, judges have to take responsibility, because that leadership and that example that we set, trickles down. And
Mm-hmm.
so it is important. But I agree with you. I think that training has to be holistic, and I think everybody who touches another human life who is serving in our courts needs to have that kind of training. And bias training really is different than racism training. And so we need to be clear that there's a distinction.
And I use this as an example because my second year I went to a race in the court seminar, and what I was stunned by was, one, it only allowed for about 50 judges, if that. Um, Two, probably some of the judges that really needed to be there weren't there. And it was so powerful. There was at least two times I got up and left the room and busted out in tears, because it was just that difficult to, process some of the imagery and some of the things, particularly around implicit bias. I know some counties have done a good job of having implicit bias training, um, through Race Matters for Juvenile Justice and some other things, but you made it very clear that there's a difference between bias training and training dealing with racism. And I don't know if people know the difference. Can you explain what the difference is?
Well, I can't tell you I'm an expert, but I think it's fair to say that all of us have biases,
Mm-hmm.
and all of us are shaped by our own personal experiences, by our own professional experiences, by where we grew up, where we live, around a whole lot of experiences, and we can only have the perspective that we have, and we've only had all of us have had limited experiences,
Mm-hmm.
and racism is very different, and there are different kinds of racism. There's institutionalized racism, there's overt, covert, and various kinds of racism, but it is grounded in race, where there is an overt or covert action or activity which prejudices one because of their race or ethnicity. But it's not just the prejudice, it's the prejudice plus the power. So
Mm-hmm.
it makes a difference if you're a judge versus, somebody who you never see again. That leverage in the relationship makes a difference around the impact of the prejudice.
There's a question here, and I'm not sure if you can answer it in the way that it's written, but it's a good question. I just think it's too more issue based that you may not be able to answer. But Earl asked, "Does the Supreme Court recognize the voter suppression issues? And if so, what role does the court play in protecting the people's right to vote?" I'm not sure how you can answer that without getting into an issue, but I
Well,
think maybe a simpler way of, I'm
and
sorry.
and into a court case, because there's litigation about that, and so because that matter very well may come before the court, I'm
You
sorry, but
can't answer that. I didn't think you could. But I think one of the big concerns that people certainly have coming up on November is obviously dealing with the issues of voter suppression, which we suspect will still be litigated up until October, November, quite possibly with injunctions and things of that nature. One of the big decisions that came down that at least impacted Mecklenburg County was how the Mecklenburg County how Mecklenburg County was broken down into different districts, and then of course how it became, at least at this point, a county-wide election. But I noticed in other counties where there were more African American, more Democratic judges that were being elected, those counties remained untouched. Um, at this point, with you being on the ballot, and now you have to designate, whereas before there wasn't a designation as far as political party. What do you think that has harmed the judicial process? Because of course we want our judges to be impartial. We should care less whether or not they are a Republican, a Democrat, or independent. But we're in a situation where that designation has to be made. Do you think that hurts a person that is looking to run for judge, but may be concerned about having to be very clear in terms of what their political affiliation is?
I don't know. This is my first partisan election. It's my fifth election, my third statewide election. And so it's my
Mhm.
first partisan election. And I don't really know the answer to that at this point, except the reality is even before there was a partisan designation on the ballot, the party systems have always sort of unofficially vetted candidates.
Mhm.
And those parties have been the ones that have sort of gotten the word out about who the candidates are, and people tend to glean that if you are a Democrat, then you must be this kind of a judge, and if you're a Republican, you must be this kind of a judge. I'm not sure that those assertions are fair, but that's just the way it is. And so, frankly, without or with the party labels, I'm sure a lot of that has gone on. I think with nonpartisan elections, it's easier, I think, to appeal to a greater electorate, and I think that's really important. I don't think that partisan politics ought to have a role in our service. When people come to my court, I'm not thinking, now do I dispense Democratic justice or Republican justice? I mean, people's lives are at stake, and so the work that we do is too serious for that.
And at this point, having served in district court, having served on the court of appeals and Supreme Court, what advice would you give to an attorney? I'm gonna ask you the same thing for a judge, but what advice would you give to an attorney who's thinking about running for judge in whatever capacity? What advice would you give them?
I would certainly encourage them to talk to other judges. And I would also encourage them to be introspective about why it is they want to be in service.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think it's important to talk with other judges to learn about their experiences, to really fully appreciate what it takes to run. It's not easy to run. It's not easy to run a local election, and it's certainly not easy to run a statewide election. And I think it's important to know what you're getting into, eyes wide open.
And so once you are now, you mentioned or you touched on this earlier. What do you think the future of technology in a perfect world with amazing funding, what do you think the future of technology looks like as far as the administration of justice? You touched on it, but perfect world, we have unlimited funding. What does that look like?
I think it would look a whole lot like the business courts in North Carolina. Their technology is absolutely amazing. And I think it would also look a lot like the federal courts. Um,
Mhm.
and I do think it's important for the public to have a level of access to court records without setting foot in a courthouse. I mean, because access to justice is hugely important.
Mhm.
Um, but that's what it would look like, that you could be anywhere in the world, have access to court records. You could do filings electronically. I mean, we would be handling so much of our work um, electronically.
And somebody did have one other question. Who makes the decision for individual courthouses in terms of what the rules are? Meaning, for example, some courthouses, you got to have masks, you have to have social distancing. That may not be true for other courthouses. Who is the person who actually makes those decisions? The presumption is it might be the chief district or the resident superior court judge, but people aren't. I'm seeing that question pop up a couple of times. Who actually makes those decisions?
I've entered several orders since March the 16th, and all of my orders have been broad enough for local judges to enter their own administrative orders as long as they're consistent with mine, and that's been happening across the state. At
Mhm.
this point, I've not addressed masks in a statewide order. And so local judges, to the extent that they have addressed masks, some courts are ordering masks and some are not ordering masks. But I have certainly been asked to consider entering an order about statewide masks, and that is under my consideration right now.
We talked about this offline before we came online because I went to another courthouse today, and nobody was wearing masks. No one. And it was, Mecklenburg County, you walk in, everybody is wearing masks. Where you need to sit is very distinctly put on, even on the benches. And where I was, I'll tell you, Chief Justice Beasley, like I did not feel safe. I didn't feel safe. I went from the um, from the initial security checkpoint where there were several deputies talking and laughing. Nobody had on masks, didn't think that was odd. Went to the courtroom, a very small courtroom. Like I could touch the person who sat beside me like we were elbow to elbow. I was the only person, myself and my client were the only two people that had on masks in the entire courtroom, including the litigants, including the judges, including the clerk's office. And I was only there about 15 minutes, but I am usually very calm, but it really disturbed me because it felt like, okay, nobody, I can't stress that enough that nobody, I literally could count on my hand, it was less than 5 people that I saw, and they were all people who were litigants. And so I know obviously you can't have that discussion here tonight, but there obviously is a big disparity in terms of how some counties are handling it and how other counties are handling it. And unfortunately, our numbers aren't going anywhere. They're about the same. Do you think? But I do have one other question I think that a couple of attorneys asked. Right now, jury trials are off the table for quite some time. Is that going to be dependent on numbers, or is it going to be dependent on the ability to actually social distance in a way that we could actually have jury trials like they have started to do, at least in the federal courts?
Well, it just depends. And as of now, I had said jury trials certainly no sooner than August the 1st. But it's important for every district to determine that they can hold jury trials safely. Traditionally, jurors sit shoulder to shoulder. Bring in the Vanari. People have audio compromised systems, and we've just got to be aware that we can't put people at greater risks. Actually, the numbers are going up every day, and it's we've got to be thoughtful about that. And it's not fair to invite people into our courts, ask them to provide a service, and not assure that they are going to be as safe as possible. So I've got to be assured that that's going to happen across the state before we go forward with jury trials.
And I won't say what county that was, but I freaked out a little bit. I'm just going to tell you. All right. So as we wrap up, for those of you if you've just tuned in, or if you're tuning in to the replay at a later time, 2 things I definitely need you to do. First thing I want you to do is make sure that you share this either as a watch party or share this directly to your page for 2 reasons. One, it's very important that each of you and your friends and your friends' friends know who Chief Justice Beasley is, and who she is as a person. And frankly, some of the courageous things that she's done in the time that she's been Chief Justice, I think it speaks volumes to address and to be very straight and authentic in terms of addressing how race intersects with justice. She is also on your ballot for re-election. She's going to be on your November ballot. For those people who may have tuned in late, what do you want people to know about you as a person as they're going through the ballot and they're spreading your name to their friends and telling them to vote for you? What do you think is most important that they know about you as a Chief Justice?
I think it's important that if people want a Chief Justice who is going to be courageous, if they want a Chief Justice who is going to be bold in her decision making, if they want a Chief Justice who's not going to be hindered in her decision making by pressure, whether it's political or otherwise, they want a Chief Justice who serves with integrity. And I can certainly tell you that I was dissuaded from making any public statements by a whole lot of folks around race. But if you want a Chief Justice who's going to do what's right because it's right, I would ask them to support me.
Absolutely. So for those of you who are tuning in, as I said, make sure that you go to chiefjusticebeasley.com. We are, several of us are hosting a virtual fundraiser on July the 28th. That's going to be from 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock p.m. That is going to be via Zoom. I'm posting the link up here in just a moment. So if you are interested in becoming or joining us for that virtual fundraiser, it will be July the 28th from 6 to 7 p.m. It's going to be via Zoom. So you'll just need to go to chiefjusticebeasley.com/July the 28th to register. She will be there and she will be able to answer the questions that you have. We are expecting some special guests that I cannot disclose as of yet, but it's going to be a lot of fun and an opportunity to really be able to interact with Chief Justice Beasley in that regard. I do encourage you absolutely go to the website to learn more about her. Certainly donate to the campaign. All of our judges are elected, and it's so important, just as she said, in that we have someone who is our Chief Justice, who is a leader, who is courageous, who is not afraid to make decisions not based on popularity or political pressure, but as she said, to do right and to do right by the people. So make sure that when you are sharing this, that you're also sharing that you obviously support Justice Beasley, but definitely share this live broadcast. Definitely share it either through the YouTube link or through the Conversation with Yolanda Trotman Facebook page. Share it and set a watch party so that people can see. Chief Justice Beasley, it has been such a pleasure to have you on tonight. I am so grateful for your time. Several people have waved. I see so many of you. Thank you all for joining. But certainly join us on July the 28th for the virtual fundraiser. Again, that's chiefjusticebeasley.com/July the 28th. There you can register. I am still in the process of forming a host committee and a sponsor committee. So if you are interested in being listed as a host or being listed as a sponsor, then just send me a direct message and I will get that information out to you. But November is coming soon. We cannot stress how important this election is on all levels, whether we are talking about your local district court or superior court judges, obviously all the way up to the Supreme Court, because it's the judges that make the decisions that affect the lives of everyday people. And to be able to have a courageous and fair and impartial jurist that is there who gets it and understands it is priceless. So thank you again, Chief Justice Beasley. I am so eternally grateful for you and for your time.
Thank you so much, Yolanda. This is a lot of fun.
Well, thank you. And next week, for those of you joining us next Wednesday, in segment 6 of the indictment, we are going to be talking about now what. So we've talked about the justice system. We're talking about it from the perspective of sheriffs and police officers. Now we're going to talk about it from the legislative perspective, because a lot of people have had questions. Okay, so now what do we do on the local level and what can we do on the state level? I've got you covered. So on the local level, I have James Smudgy Mitchell. Councilman Mitchell will be here. And on the state level, North Carolina Senator Mushtaba Muhammad will be here. And we'll be talking about their individual stories, but we'll be also talking about some of the important state legislation that has passed or is on the horizon, and what you can do as individuals to be able to exercise your voice in order to affect change in a meaningful way, not to just talk about it, but what we can do in a meaningful way to affect change. Again, that will be next Wednesday at 8. Again, thank you so much, Chief Justice Beasley. And of course, as always, make sure that you like, you follow, and subscribe at all things at the Convo Pod Show. Thank you so much. Y'all have a good night.